Yes, so Hairless here. Today we have a Patreon request. Thank you to Laurie for this one. This is Il Divo, Time to Say Goodbye from London in 2011. Now, I know the song. I'm pretty sure everyone knows this song, but I wasn't actually sure of the song's origin. It was first performed in 1995 by Andrea Bocelli, and it was an Italian song called Dónde, Partirò, which means With You I Shall Depart. The following year, Bocelli released a version with Sarah Brightman. That version was called Time to Say Goodbye, and it achieved much more success. It was sung partly in English. They have also done a version in German and Italian. So there are probably many more versions of the song with the lyrics being sung in various languages, it seems. I've heard the song many times before, but I don't know which version exactly. I don't ever recall seeing it live in a concert, but I've definitely seen it on TV and on the radio. As for Il Divo, I've heard of them. I feel like everyone has heard of them. They're a product of Simon Cowell, but I don't know the members individually. A brief bit of background on Il Divo. They're a classical crossover group. The most similar artist I've reacted to would probably be Forestella. My Forestella playlist will be up here if you're interested. Il Divo's members are from various countries and their voice types are within the kind of baritone to tenor ranges. Sadly, one of the members of the performance that we'll be looking at, Carlos Marin, he passed away a few years ago, so the current Il Divo lineup is slightly different to this. I'll be referring to the members in this video either by their voice type or using my mouse. This is not a sign of disrespect at all. I always do this with new groups because I like to figure out who's singing which part, and people can let me know in the comments about each member. So I think let's get straight into this one.
Quando sono solo sogno all'orizzonte mancan le parole. Sì, lo so che non c'è luce in una stanza quando manca il sole. Se non ci sei tu con me su. Le finestre mostra tutti il mio cuore che hai acceso, chiudi dentro me la luce che hai incontrato per strada. Time to say goodbye.
Okay, quick stop there. As usual, this is where we'll go over and analyse what we've just heard. If you don't want to hear my analysis, go to the timestamp here. Cool, yeah, I mean, I really can't remember the last time I saw Il Divo on TV. So it's cool looking at them nice up and close and actually getting into the music now. We're in the same key as the key that we might expect. To compare to a 1997 performance I found of Bocelli and Brightman. As Il Divo is an all-male quartet, none of whom are countertenors or male sopranos, we naturally don't have any of the higher register that Brightman could offer. This must make things more interesting when it comes to arranging for Il Divo. Not so much the solo parts, but when they all are singing together at the same time. We saw some harmonies come in just as I paused, so I'll be very surprised if they don't sing in harmony for a lot of the rest of the song, for maybe some more grandiose or powerful moments. But because there's no countertenor or male soprano, all their parts are contained within a similar range. This is naturally restrictive and can get quite messy if not arranged well. So I'm very interested to see what they do with that when we do continue. Introducing us to them, it was a nice scene. How pensive these silhouettes. I don't know much about Il Divo's fan base, but the impression I get is that they're very, very dedicated fans. You know, they absolutely adore them. So having a visual like this to introduce Il Divo must be great for all the fans there. It reminds me of the Jersey Boys. So the singing, we start with Carlos in Italian. Carlos is the member who's no longer with us. He has a baritone voice, so starting with him makes sense because we can move to the tenors of the group when the melody moves up in pitch for the famous part. I think there are many reasons why people love this song, why it's so well adored across the world, and the main one is because of the melody. If we take the melody, isolate it, look at it, it's not a typical melody in the sense that I feel it's designed to be stimulating and a bit different. It's a bit all over the shop, but in a strategic way. So just there we've heard this. First, we have an interval of a fifth, dropping 5 notes, and that's a larger interval surrounded by smaller intervals. Also, these smaller intervals are stepwise, and they're not stepwise. So things aren't constant, they're different on a more micro scale. After that phrase, we then want to drop down from here to here. That's the natural sound. But then the next phrase, when it's sung, we're in G, but the melody is sung on the 5th degree, 5 notes up on this note. And it's essentially a repeated note. So the other notes that we hear are this, and then this. These other notes are kind of like additional notes that temporarily take us away from this repeated D that we keep returning to. Maybe it's just me, but subconsciously I'm feeling a bit more comfortable because of this repeated note. I'm familiar with it. I often say repeated notes are used to make a melody catchy. It's much easier to remember the same note after one hearing than something that has loads of different notes. And then finally, when we break away from this repeated note, we have this jump. 6 notes up, it is a major 6th. I said the same thing in yesterday's pentatonics video actually, but I believe a major 6th is intrinsically a catchy interval. It's distinctive. From our starting note, 1 octave is 8 notes. It's rare to see jumps larger than that in the melody. So the next biggest one is 7 notes. But that can often sound irregular. So 6 notes. So the major 6th is the largest feasible, not so irregular sounding jump for a melody. Quite fitting considering we've just been returning to the same note and repeating it before then. And whilst we're on the topic of why people love the melody, the opening, it's quite self-explanatory. These repeated 3-note rising patterns, which promote an idea of rhythmic irregularity within themselves, it's not boring. Alright, so if we go back to where we just were, the second singer to enter, his voice, it sounds like a baritone to me. But he seems to be a bit more on the crossover side of things, a bit less classical, a bit more pop-y. So I wonder what all of their backgrounds are. Right, so we've since heard the tenor's entry with the time to say goodbye. Back to the point of which intervals to use, now is probably the most famous part of the melody. That's an octave jump. As I said before, you don't really get jumps bigger than that. This is a big jump to take him right to the upper parts of his tenor register. It's cementing the shift from the baritones that we've heard now to the tenor or tenors, and we've now switched to English from Italian. For me, it's interesting to see how each singer chooses to sing each phrase, where they'll place the emphasis, where they'll choose the most dynamic contrast, where they'll hit a note immediately or if they'll slide into it. Here's an example of him choosing to slide into a note. If we compare it again to the 1997 recording I showed earlier, it is Brightman singing at this point and she doesn't slide, she just chooses to arrive on the note immediately. Being a classical crossover quartet, I imagine Il Divo have a bit more freedom in what they can do. They're not strictly classical. Many people might associate classical as being very proper, formal, pretentious perhaps. So this might be a reason why Il Divo achieved so much global success, because they're not bound or restricted by such labels. Alright, let's carry on.
lontana sogno all'orizzonte mancano le parole e io sì lo so che sei con me, tu mia luna, tu sei qui con me, io sole, tu sei qui con me, con me, con me, con me. Time to say goodbye. Horizons are never far. If I live on this life with pride, holding eternal love in my heart, I will go on ships over seas that I now know. No, they don't exist anymore. It's time to say goodbye, so with you I will go on ships over seas that I now know.
Alright, I think they might go very high, at least one of the tenors, and I'm cautious of copyright, so I want to get one more pause in before we go to the end. Suspense. We've seen some progressions in terms of the music, in terms of the visuals, so let's go over and talk about what we've heard in that recent section. We get the fourth member entering now. He's not yet had a solo.
My heart, I will go.
We have three of them singing, as Carlos was the baritone. I assume it is this fourth member who is a tenor with the higher harmony here, singing 1/3, so 3 notes above this tenor here. I mean, to be honest, it's three of them singing, but
Eternal love in my heart.
I can't really hear Carlos. I think he's singing this same note. That's the tiny issue with performances like these where there's this massive orchestral sound. It can be a bit difficult to hear each part clearly. Like just after that, I can only hear 2 parts again. So Carlos and the first tenor we heard are singing the lower part, and then the fourth member to enter, the other tenor, is singing the upper part. But at the end of this phrase, I think I can hear Carlos singing an independent part very, very quietly.
I will go.
He is singing a 9/8 suspension, although I can't actually hear him resolve the suspension. What I mean by that is cue Sir Hairless from the future. We have an E minor chord. This is E. The 2 tenors are singing the 3rd and the 5th notes. So the chord of E minor. A suspension is a method of causing tension. You hold one note that doesn't belong in a chord and then you resolve that note. A 9/8 suspension is effectively the same thing as a 2/1 suspension, so let's call it that. 2/1 suspension just means that we move from the second note to the first note, with E being the first note. So in the chord, instead of the first note we have the second note. That there is the suspension, which would usually resolve. But I don't hear Carlos resolving, so he leaves us with this unresolved suspended note. It's juicy, a little bit tense, a good way to set us up for what's to follow.
On ships over sea.
Now the 3-part harmony is clear. Carlos is clearly singing that D note that we heard repeated earlier. And just while we're on the topic of suspensions, here is one in the violin part. Listen out for... They're very easy to hear when you know what you're listening out for. When they were singing in harmony and they were approaching the famous high note, I was wondering if they were going to continue singing in harmony in thirds, 3 notes apart. That would have meant the part above the melody would have gone up to this B up here. That's really high. But they go back to one voice for this part. Then we get a solo from the 4th member, so now all of them have had a solo section, which is nice. And the other tenor now offers the higher harmony, so the 2 tenors' roles have reversed. And the section that follows, the harmonies seem to be more like accompanying motifs rather than a secondary melody. They really drive this idea home at the end of the phrase. Very airy voices all round, all kind of coming off. A bit further on, Carlos, the baritone with the melody, he goes up to a top G. That's definitely a tenor note, so all the members appear to be quite versatile. What I was saying earlier about them all having similar ranges, so it being quite restrictive, maybe this works in their favour as an element of surprise. We never know who's going to be singing next. And then a bit further on, now they are singing the melody in harmony, so they do go up to that top B. Which leads into a key change. We've moved slightly up, so now everything will be a little bit higher. Alright, let's carry on from where we left off. What a way to end. I was specifically asked to watch this video and there's still 30 seconds, and hovering over the timeline it looks like there's still some to go. Another ending, perhaps? Alright, well, we got that same huge ending again. That's a way to impress your fans for sure. I'll speak about that ending when we go back over the analysis on that last section. Because we had that key change where we moved up slightly, now the highest tenor part goes up to a top C sharp. That's one note higher than a top C, which is what I call a wow tenor moment. We can also hear the audio engineering going on at any given time. The singer with the melody is always the loudest part that we hear. At this moment, for example, tenors singing up there, they will be belting. That will be a powerful, powerful sound. I mean, we can even hear the strain on his voice there. Yet, it's one of the quietest parts, acting as a harmonic support for the melody. And Carlos himself, he now sings an A. That is not expected of a baritone. Why I call him a baritone is because of the sound produced by his voice. Natural tenors, sometimes called leggero tenors, meaning light tenors, have a different sounding voice. They can naturally just sing higher in their full voice. To use clips from the classical crossover group I mentioned in the introduction called Forestella, Forestella's baritone also sings much higher than expected, which is a top C sharp. So when someone is given a voice type when they're called a baritone or a tenor, it doesn't necessarily mean they're restricted to sing within that expected range. I liked this little bit of chromaticism here. Sliding notes upwards, always nice. And then towards the end, when they come down the steps, each pair on either side swaps positions. I wonder why that is. Anyway, they come down for this huge ending. I like the choreography as well. So simple but effective. I think they only moved twice in the whole performance. That's it. And that huge ending. Yeah, we hear Carlos singing that top A. And then the highest tenor part is going up to a D. And because it's so high, it sounds like it's sung in a blended voice. So he's mixing his head voice with his chest voice. Yeah, big ending. Cool, well, let's leave that one there. Il Divo, that's a name I've not heard for quite a while. So very interesting to come and get into them and see them up close. Thanks again for this request. And thank you to everyone for watching. Would very much appreciate a like and subscribe. If you enjoy my content, want to support me, vote on future polls, you can do so by joining the Patreon or YouTube memberships linked below. And I will see you next time.